We're good, Brian.
Are we live? Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. We're switching it up this week. I am Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman. I am doing a remote in to the studio. Very exciting, testing the tech, and hopefully all goes as planned. But Brian Morgenstern with Sam Lyman, a momentous day in Bitcoin politics, business. We have markets on a rocky road right now. We have a new entrant to the presidential race. And what does it all mean for Bitcoin? Oh, and fiat economists poo-pooing the latest proposals for a national Bitcoin strategic reserve. These topics and others will be covered on the pod. At some point, we're going to have entrance music to follow these cold opens. But for now, we'll just dive right in. Sam, where do we begin?
Yeah, well, first let me begin, Brian, by just commenting on your t-shirt, "Come and mine it." That's pretty good Bitcoin lore right there. It's very, very good. Yeah, with that, let's go straight to Kamala Harris. So we are about 16 days into Kamala Harris being the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, and yet she's still has not held a press conference. She has stuck to her script throughout the campaign trail. Seems to be a continuation in many ways of the teleprompter presidency that we've seen under Biden. And her campaign website has no meaningful policy positions whatsoever. Dylan, can you pull up her website real quick? Let's just give everyone a quick tour of this website. You go onto it, first page, meet Vice President Kamala Harris. And you go through, it's a long and extended bio about her childhood and how she came into power. And then if you look anywhere for policy positions, or anything like that, you'll find absolutely nothing at all. They give you options to, of course, donate money to the campaign, but that's about it. So the Kamala Harris presidency has a lot of question marks surrounding it. The question is, can she hide from American voters for the next 90 days? Is it really the strategy of this campaign just to keep her a mystery to voters and hope that they'll depend solely on vibes? Brian, what are your thoughts? Do you think that they can keep Kamala stuck to the teleprompter in the same way that they kept Joe Biden hidden in the basement? What do you see as the path forward for a Kamala Harris campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me put on my seldom worn Democrat strategist hat, because as we know, Bitcoin knows no political parties. It doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. But let's just look at it sort of objectively. The Biden campaign in 2020 was successful, I think, in large part due to the "I'm not Donald Trump" campaign. And that has roots in the way I think about it. And I think I've said this on the show before. The movie Private Parts, about Howard Stern's life, has a scene with Paul Giamatti, his producer, running in and saying, "Your ratings are off the charts." And 40% of your audience loves you because they don't know what you're going to say next. 60% of your audience hates you because they don't know what you're going to say next. And that was sort of the way I think the Democrats played against Trump in 2020. After all, a presidential election is a binary choice. So I think you're seeing a bit of a continuation of that. They're taking the strategy of, don't give our opponents policy targets to shoot at, in hopes that just negative feelings towards Trump will carry the day. I don't think that works for a full 90 days. I think they're going to have to take positions, if for no other reason than this strategy is reliant on turning out their progressive base. And their voters do need some reason to vote for them, not just against Trump, although progressives really don't like Donald Trump. So I would expect in the next few months, with the Democratic apparatus sort of gelling together and trying to win this election, I would think there'll be some professional kind of policy rollouts. They seem to be trying to embrace more of the Midwestern blue collar vote, which combined with some changes in minority political preferences, as well as suburban women who are always up for grabs in recent elections. They're going to have to start talking to those voting blocks. to try to motivate voters to vote for something in a positive way, as opposed to just being anti-Trump. So that's what I think the strategy is going to be. Obviously, I'm not, in that business at this point, and I'm not certainly not advising the Harris campaign or anything. I'm just trying to read tea leaves here. Um, that's what I see happening today as we are airing. Just in the last, short amount of time this morning, they did announce her running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. Now, I think this is telling because the runner-up was Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, viewed as a little bit more pro-business and moderate in terms of his standing in the Democratic Party. Tim Walz is a sort of avowed progressive, has made very friendly comments about socialism. During the 2020 riots, received a lot of criticism for being late in calling in the National Guard to tamp down riots, being somewhat sympathetic towards the Summer of Love rioters. He has signed some pretty radical bills. He's been very sort of pro-illegal immigrant. He had a comment that he wants to invest in a ladder company to help illegals come across the border. So really a far left choice, though he is the governor of Minnesota, a so-called flyover state. So interesting choice. I think bringing it back to Bitcoin and what does it mean? Senator Harris and Vice President Harris personally does not have much of a record on these issues, but for the Biden administration's record on these issues, which has been very hostile. So they've gone after Bitcoin miners' energy use. They've attacked self-custody. They have promoted a CBDC, although they say they're not, the apparatus is moving in, seems to be moving in that direction when you look at the administration. So if she's to change Bitcoin miners' hearts and minds, she would really have to repudiate the policies of the administration from which she is running. Governor Walz doesn't have a lot of record on these issues as well, though his embrace of the progressive base, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, the squad, his actions during the 2020 riots seem to portend a sympathy for the far left, which, if that pattern holds, would probably put him in the camp of a CBDC, although I don't see a lot of public record on that issue. So we don't know, but it seems likely that it's not going to be positive for Bitcoiners in terms of what the Democratic ticket looks like. So we have posited before, and perhaps we'll posit again, that this could be the last real election where Bitcoin is a political football, because there's a lot of money and voters at stake. They're not particularly partisan. They are gettable voters, but really President Trump has embraced Bitcoin and the sort of the values of Bitcoin, and the Democrats really have not at this point. Perhaps there will be, interesting takeaways from the postmortem of this election. Who knows? But really a momentous day, and we'll see where it leads. I think I answered your question and maybe then some, but let me stop there and let's get your take.
Yeah, that was comprehensive. It's been fascinating to see Kamala's pick of Tim Walz. As a Republican strategist, if I were one, I would be celebrating this pick because she ended up picking someone who is a leftist in a non-swing state, which Republicans were hoping she would do exactly that. It definitely gives the Trump camp hope. And it's telling, too, about the ideological direction of the Democratic Party. They've had a chance to pivot. It's my personal belief that we reached peak woke in the 2020 to 2022 period. The culture and companies themselves are rejecting that hyper progressivism that took root in corporate America, in Hollywood, in academia. And it's clear that the American people want to move in a different direction. So I was quite surprised to see that Kamala Harris picked someone like Tim Walz. Let's remember that the last time Tim Walz and Kamala Harris teamed up, it was during the racial reckoning of 2020, or some say the Summer of Love protests. And at that time, Governor Walz practically let his cities burn, while Kamala Harris helped raise money to bail out some of the criminals involved in those riots and the violence associated with them. So either the Democratic Party is so ensconced in its own bubble that they are unaware that this is not the desire of the American people to continue in that woke direction, or they're just doubling down, thinking that they continue to control the sense making institutions that will encourage more and more Americans to go in that direction. I've also found it very interesting that Josh Shapiro was passed over. And I think the elephant in the room for the Democratic Party is everybody knows why he was passed over. It's because Josh Shapiro is Jewish and he is very pro-Israel. And there's a rising faction within the Democratic Party that is very anti-Israel and would not be happy with a Jewish person on the ticket. And the anti-Semitism that appears to be rampant now in the Democratic Party is a real cause for concern, in my opinion. In my opinion, Josh Shapiro was a very qualified VP candidate. I think he would have been more of a bulldog on the campaign trail for Kamala Harris. I think he was a better speaker in many ways and didn't have the same extremely progressive positions that Tim Walz had and represented a swing state. So I thought that was a fascinating decision by the Kamala Harris campaign to skip over Josh Shapiro in favor of Walz. One last thought I have on the whole Kamala Harris phenomenon. Up to this point, as we mentioned earlier, this isn't about policy. It's all about vibes. You have Megan Thee Stallion performing at Kamala Harris's campaigns. You've got TikTok dances going viral about how to support Kamala Harris. You have so much fluff and so little substance. And I think that's by design because Kamala Harris is the selection of the donor class. Let's remember that she wasn't really even voted for by members of the Democratic Party throughout the primary process. She was more or less handpicked by donors after they muscled out Biden to be the nominee. And so I think what we'll see in a Kamala Harris presidency, if she is elected, is just a continuation of what we've seen for the past 4 years, where you have what's more or less a figurehead president who is there portraying, like I said, good vibes, being personable on camera, glad handing, maybe dancing as Kamala Harris does to make people feel good about the presidency and just the energy that's exuded from the White House. But in reality, she's not the one who is calling the shots here. I think we all know that. I highly doubt that Democrats themselves think that Kamala Harris is the best president to have should World War III break out or should the world economy crumble. I think they know deep down that she is not the best executive to have in that position, but they also know that they don't need an executive who's strong-handed and strong-willed in that position, because what has been running the show for the past several years is the administrative state, is this faceless bureaucracy who clearly is running the White House right now and who is calling all the shots in the executive branch, because we all know, and it's very clear since the debate, that Joe Biden isn't doing that right now. So I think it adds a different dimension to this election where you have two very stark choices, not just between candidates, but in terms of what the American presidency will look like. In Kamala Harris, you have the choice of choosing a presidency that is a figurehead presidency, almost like the King or Queen of England has become a figurehead. They are filling a role that is mostly ceremonial, and in the background, you have the permanent bureaucracy running the show. Or an alternative is Donald Trump, who stands in contrast to all of that, stands in contrast to the permanent bureaucracy. In fact, he wants to trim down that bureaucracy and restore the idea of a strong executive who's actually calling the shots. And so the American people have a really stark choice to make this November. I mean, my personal preference is that the American president in that office actually means something and that you actually have a strong executive running the country and not a faceless bureaucracy, but that's up for the American people to decide. And Brian, you mentioned as well at the end, what does this all mean for Bitcoin? So interestingly, Kamala has indicated that she's willing to shift her position on crypto. But the question is this lip service or is this something more meaningful? And Dylan, if you wouldn't mind pulling up, not the second tweet with the polls that I showed, but the tweet that talks about, should be the third link in there, that talks about this potential meeting between Kamala Harris's campaign and executives within the crypto industry. Do you have that by chance? Yes, this one. So we received reports last week that Ro Khanna, who's sort of been appointed the peacemaker between crypto and the Democratic Party, was putting together a gathering. And that gathering would include people from the Kamala Harris campaign, to meet with industry leaders within the cryptocurrency industry. This was supposed to take place yesterday, but it didn't. It was canceled. It was also very vague who from the Kamala Harris campaign would even attend this meeting. So, Brian, this all raises the question: do you think that Kamala Harris's apparent softening on crypto is a true pivot, or is this a head fake?
Uh, it's a great question, and they're kind of leaving us hanging a little bit. We were fortunate to have conversations with both Congressman Ro Khanna and Wiley Nickel, who are sort of pro-innovation Democrats. I mean, Ro Khanna himself has said that he thinks being anti-Bitcoin is like being anti-laptop or anti-cell phone, in the 90s. That it's just not really going to make that much sense in the future. The degree to which their voices are being heard by the campaign really remains to be seen because, as you said, the Harris camp didn't even allow this roundtable discussion to come together. So we're not really sure. What we are sure of is that the far left of the Democratic Party seems to be in favor of a central bank digital currency, which would allow the government to have the ability to track and control people's spending. As an example, examples of such a financial system you can see in China with the digital, with their CBDC being used to control the population, in certainly, in certain parts, pilot projects and things. And then you're also, we've seen real life examples of the Canadian truckers when they were protesting vaccine mandates, having their GoFundMes shut down. We've seen some examples in the US of progressive members of Congress calling in, oil executives or banking executives and trying to put pressure on them to cut off service to industries that they don't like oil and gas, like firearms manufacturers, payday lenders, others that they deem out of political favor, and they want to be able to kind of cut off services and marginalize those parts of the American population. So some troubling behavior we've seen in terms of financial freedom coming from the left. I think to your point about Governor Walz as the pick for VP, I mean, just to give you a sense of what some Republican strategists are saying in response, they seem to be rather jubilant. And our friend Josh Holmes, who has, longtime aide to Senator McConnell, posted basically a meme as his reaction of an Olympic pole vaulter uh, putting the pole in the ground, getting all the way up to the bar, and then just falling backwards. And that was his characterization of the Harris camp's first major decision of this campaign, which is picking a vice president. It doesn't seem to be a good omen for Bitcoiners and the policies that they're hoping for. It seems to be really doubling down on the far left part of the Democratic Party. So they're not really being clear. They canceled the roundtable. They haven't taken any public positions, but we have the Biden administration's record to lean on. That's pretty much all we have right now in terms of policy signals. So doesn't look very good at this point in time. But we've got it's August. Election day is until November. Of course, certain states have election month now, so it's an even more compressed time frame. And the media will run interference. We know that Vice President Harris has been sort of trying to memory hole some of her past positions of, being in favor of open borders. The media has been trying to convince the American people that she wasn't actually ever the border czar, even though their own reporting showed that she was the border czar. She was very proudly, when she was representing California in the Senate, I think kind of campaigned to be labeled the most liberal senator, and now that is being erased from, I think it was GovTrack, whatever the website was. That's now been taken down. So they're really trying to kind of memory hole her record and portray her as a moderate now, but that's going to be even harder to believe now that she has chosen Governor Walz, who has characterized socialism as just another person's neighborliness or friendliness. That is chilling and certainly does not uh, betray, positive vibes towards Bitcoiners or people who want financial freedom. So we'll see where we go from here. They're certainly being a bit cagey in terms of where they're going to land on these things. But the signals so far do not seem positive for Bitcoin.
I'm with you. I would love to see her make a true pivot on Bitcoin. I think it's in her best interest to do so because it would remove it as a wedge issue that the Trump campaign is using to glean more votes. But it seems like the ideological predispositions of this campaign will prevent her from doing that. So I guess we'll watch how it unfolds. It'll be really interesting to see how. But keeping on this same idea of a crypto pivot, we had some really interesting legislation come out last week, Brian. That was from Senator Lummis, and we teased this legislation during our episode last week. We didn't really have too many of the details yet, but now that the official text has been released, we know what this bill is all about. And this bill, of course, is the Bitcoin Act, which was introduced by Senator Cynthia Lummis. And the Bitcoin Act establishes a strategic Bitcoin reserve in the United States. And here are the details. Senator Lummis wants the United States to accumulate about 5% of the total Bitcoin supply. That's about equivalent to how much of the gold supply the United States currently owns. And in real terms, that's approximately 1 million Bitcoin. So what's most interesting about this bill that she's introduced is that it wouldn't come at any additional expense to taxpayers to pay for this Bitcoin, to buy it up, because it would draw from existing funds at the US Treasury and at the Federal Reserve. And so that's great news. If we can gobble up 5% of the world's Bitcoin supply as a country, that puts us in a great geostrategic position going forward, should Bitcoin truly become the next store of value on the same plane as gold. So really interesting idea. And I think it offers an opportunity for Democrats to sort of change their tune on Bitcoin and digital assets. Bitcoin, as we know, is the least controversial cryptocurrency out there. It's the flagship cryptocurrency. It's the cryptocurrency that's been adopted by Wall Street, even nation states like El Salvador, and pretty soon could be the United States as well. And so in many ways, Bitcoin is also Lindy in the sense that it's proven itself. The lifespan of cryptocurrency is greatly accelerated compared to typical assets. And so that's something to keep in mind. But it is a time-tested asset that is growing more into its own, which raises an interesting question. Could Democrats use Senator Lummis's bill as an olive branch by simply supporting it, by supporting this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve? We more or less already have one with the approximately 200,000 Bitcoin that we currently own through confiscating assets from illicit actors. So in a certain sense, we already have somewhat of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, but Senator Lummis just takes the logic of Bitcoin to the next level. Brian, what are your thoughts on this idea of using Senator Lummis's new bill as an olive branch, a way for Democrats to simply hit the reset button by merely supporting this bill?
Yeah, I think it's a low risk, high reward proposition, which is similar to what you and I have said, when we were making the case to the Trump campaign that they should pivot on these issues on Bitcoin, and that embracing this technology that will be foundational, we believe, to the economy of the future, you can get votes, you can get campaign donations, and you can be correct on the policy. And I think this is similarly a low risk, high reward proposition for Democrats. Senator Lummis has been courting bipartisan support for a lot of her legislation in this space. She has worked closely with Senator Gillibrand from New York, not exactly a conservative icon, so, to be sure. She has worked with other Democrats to really try to mainstream these ideas. And I think this would make a lot of sense, particularly for frontline vulnerable Democrats to try to distinguish themselves from the far left, to express a willingness to work across the aisle and to really moderate themselves. So it seems like a really nice opportunity that Senator Lummis is presenting for bipartisanship. The U.S. and governments around the world invest in strategic assets all the time. Canada has a strategic maple syrup reserve. The U.S. owns like 70% of the Western United States in terms of land holdings. Of course, in terms of strategic reserves, we have an oil reserve. We have the gold depository. There are a number of things that nation states can hold on their balance sheets that make their economies more resilient. I think Bitcoin should fall into that category, notwithstanding its historic volatility. Some of the critics point that out, and fair enough, but the market's still maturing, and now it's maturing at a much more rapid pace with some of the largest asset managers on earth offering Bitcoin ETFs. I think it's sort of low-hanging fruit. And so this should be something Bitcoiners pay attention to. Are you in favor of the United States investing in Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin as a way of strengthening the dollar, as a way of looking towards the future? Or are they going to, I think in our view, kind of cut off their nose to spite their face and just say no to everything? This is a pretty easy lift for them to get on board. So I think Senator Lummis is working hard to get bipartisan support for this. I'm hopeful that she will achieve that. For the time being, she's got President Trump on board for a strategic reserve. He didn't go as far as she did. He expressed support for the idea of turning our existing holdings into a strategic reserve. She took it a step further in terms of accumulating more Bitcoin, 5%, as you say, to sort of match the strategic gold reserve. Whether you fall in President Trump's camp or Senator Lummis's camp, I think that Democrats who are trying to appeal across the aisle should see the wisdom in not selling your Bitcoin. We know what happens when countries start dumping Bitcoin. We saw what happened when Germany did it just recently in the last month or so. They were roundly mocked as making sort of a knee-jerk bad decision. So we have a recent case study that should make it even easier for Republicans and Democrats alike to support this idea. So we don't know how it's going to play out. We don't have a crystal ball, but we're glad that Senator Lummis is taking a leadership role on this issue, and hopefully Republicans and Democrats will come together and support it.
Yeah, that would be the ideal scenario, no doubt. It's also really promising that Representative Ro Khanna, who is a Democrat, has come out himself and endorsed the idea of a national strategic Bitcoin reserve. The fact that you have the person who is brokering a peace deal between Democrats and the cryptocurrency industry, he himself is supporting strategic Bitcoin reserve. That is fantastic. And hopefully he can encourage more of his colleagues to do the same. I really do see Senator Lummis's bill as an opportunity for Democrats just to wipe the slate clean, to start over completely when it comes to their approach to Bitcoin and digital assets. This is a fantastic bill that, in my opinion, could really improve the long-term geostrategic position of the United States and could strengthen our finances. And why wouldn't both right and left be for that? I think it's an amazing opportunity for them to come forward and change the tune and to show that, yes, Bitcoin is bipartisan. There's supports, or at least it can be bipartisan, that there can be support for this idea from both sides of the aisle. And if anybody's office can do that, I think it's Senator Lummis's office. She is orange pilling members of Congress one by one, had a pretty important role, I think, in orange pilling the president as well. And let's see what happens. I think that we really do have a shot at this, though. And I think it's important that we continue to move forward on it. And it's interesting because the strategic Bitcoin reserve could also play a pretty important role in strengthening our nation's finances and potentially alleviating the national debt. So Senator Lummis actually went on CNBC last week to explain this idea a little bit further. Dylan, do you mind playing us that clip?
Diversified asset allocation of hard assets, including gold and including Bitcoin. It not only creates a diversified asset allocation, because we already have US dollars and treasuries and foreign currencies. It adds another very hard asset that could be put in cold storage, just the way we hold gold in cold storage, and allow it to grow in market value, backing the US dollar. if we held 1 million Bitcoin for 20 years, we would have enough money to reduce the national debt in half.
You talk about.
So that's a really interesting clip. And Brian, I don't know if it came through the audio on your end, but it's where Senator Cynthia Lummis says that if we held 1 million Bitcoin for 20 years, we could actually halve the national debt. So really interesting idea. And it seems to be a sticky idea because President Trump said something similar when he was doing a media interview last week. Do you mind playing that clip, Dylan?
They think it's good. Who knows? Maybe we'll pay off our $35 trillion, hand them a little crypto check, right? We'll hand them a little Bitcoin and wipe out our $35 trillion.
But how do you?
Thank you. And so I love that when President Trump says, maybe we'll hand them a little crypto check to pay off our national debt, hand them a little bit of Bitcoin. So it's a fascinating idea. We have long thought that Bitcoin was, some people thought it was an enemy to the US dollar, but in reality, it might be the savior of the US economy, according to some policymakers. Brian, what do you make of this? What do you make of the idea that Bitcoin can actually be used to alleviate the national debt and potentially strengthen the US dollar over the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a worthy idea. Look, the U.S. has been reliant, I think, for too many years on just the ability to print more money, and the liquidity of U.S. debt. I think it makes sense for the U.S. to shift, even in this, maybe symbolic or maybe small way, towards holding appreciating assets, so that someday we have a hope of having our balance sheet look more balanced, of having assets greater than our liabilities. And Bitcoin is the best performing asset of the last decade. There's been a lot of reporting on that. And so it would be, I think, a positive step to shift away from this reliance on debt, away from this reliance on inflating away our currency, and moving towards holding appreciating hard assets, to strengthen our resilience, to strengthen our financial health as a nation. So I'm glad this conversation is taking place, and I certainly hope that enthusiasm for it grows over time. We'll see who is more forward-looking and who is more sort of entrenched in the ideas of the past. Maybe we'll see a sea change with this election. We keep saying this could be the Bitcoin election. You have tens of millions of Americans, millions of them in swing states. We, help operate the Bitcoin Voter Project. Another plug for that. Follow it on social media at Bitcoin Voter. Go to the website, bitcoinvoterproject.org, and sign up if you care about these issues and you want our politicians to care about these issues. I think it makes a lot of sense for our government to look at things in this way. And techno-optimism, which I think is a coin, I think it was Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, venture capitalist, pro-innovation advocate, Elon Musk and others in Silicon Valley, some of the Sequoia Capital partners have really pointed out the degree to which censorship, a lack of free speech, a desire to control and regulate businesses out of existence has made the U.S. less competitive. That doesn't have to be a partisan issue. And so, this could be a good step in that direction. But again, time will tell if candidates this cycle start to adopt that position or not.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that they do, in large part because the game theory of Bitcoin almost requires that all politicians endorse it in time. What do I mean by that? If you're an individual, as Satoshi once said, it might make sense to accumulate Bitcoin in case it catches on. And so if you buy Bitcoin now and the network continues to grow, you will reap tremendous rewards. Whereas if you choose not to buy Bitcoin, you'll miss out on a lot of gains. And the same logic holds on a corporation level and on a nation state level, and arguably on a political level as well. If you're a political leader who chooses to embrace Bitcoin now, you could be activating a voting bloc that could very well swing this election, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast. Whereas if you choose not to embrace Bitcoin, you might be actually alienating potentially tens of thousands, if not millions of voters. So it makes sense to embrace it just from a game theoretic framework alone. I think it's really interesting as well, this idea that maybe we get a little more creative with how we pay off our debt. So when it comes to paying off our national debt, you have two age-old answers: either cut spending and entitlement programs or raise taxes. And the appetite to do either one of those things has proven to be incredibly low over the last couple of decades. And so I think we do need to think outside the box with what are some other ways we could pay back our debt. Accumulating Bitcoin is a really compelling option. I think there's even an analog to this with Switzerland. In the 2010s, the Swiss National Bank bought up a lot of tech stocks. People saw it as high risk, and certainly there was risk involved with that strategy, but it's definitely paid off for them up to this point. So Bitcoin is many things. It arguably will be the best store of value over time, but it also trades very similarly to tech stocks, or at least it has historically. And so I see this idea of accumulating Bitcoin as being similar to a national bank putting some more high risk, high reward stocks on its balance sheet. And the dividends of that could potentially be enormous, especially if the Bitcoin thesis plays out like we think it will, and it achieves parity with gold or even surpasses gold as a store of value. As Senator Lummis herself said, in 20 years from now, that could potentially half the US national debt. So there's a real opportunity here. And I think there's, this is a bold and fresh plan by Senator Lummis that unsurprisingly is getting a lot of hate from Keynesian economists, or as we like to say in the Bitcoin industry, fiat economists. Foremost among them is Paul Krugman. So Paul Krugman is a professional blowhard and the serially wrong New York Times columnist who just hates Bitcoin more than anything, which honestly, in my view, is an incredibly bullish sign for the industry. Why is that? It's because Paul Krugman is the Jim Cramer of the limousine liberal East Coast elite class. He gets so many things wrong, especially when it comes to emerging technologies. And he has a history of one blunder after another. Let's go all the way back to the 2021 time period after the big money print with COVID. Paul Krugman said that inflation was transitory. In fact, he was one of the biggest cheerleaders calling inflation transitory. And we actually have a link to his exact statements on this. Do you mind pulling up that first link, Dylan? So to his credit, Paul Krugman said, I was wrong about inflation. He was about a year too late. A lot of the damage had already been done to the US economy. And he, he has a mea culpa here. He says, I was wrong about inflation. Here are the reasons why I got it wrong. So shout out to Paul Krugman. You demonstrated some important humility there, but you didn't really learn your lesson because about a year later, Paul Krugman declares the war on inflation over. Do you mind pulling up that article? Yeah, thanks, Dylan. So the war on inflation is over. We won at very little cost. This had real George W. Bush on the Navy battleship with the mission accomplished banner behind him kind of vibes. I remember seeing this at the time and just thinking like, ooh, don't speak too soon. Because as the American people know all too well, inflation is still really bad. They still continue to go to the grocery store and see prices rising. They still continue to get hurt at the gas pump. It's rough times out there. And so, yeah, Paul Krugman got inflation really wrong. He's also gotten Bitcoin really wrong since the very start. Do you mind pulling up the next link, Dylan? Thank you. So this is an article that Paul Krugman wrote way back in 2013 in which he calls Bitcoin evil. He recently called it a scandal-ridden and value-destroying industry as well. In his most recent op-ed where he decries the idea of a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And so just to give you a taste of what this guy's record on technology is, let's pull up that final link and see what Paul Krugman said about the internet. This is an exact quote from him. The growth of the internet will slow drastically as the flaw in Metcalfe's law becomes apparent. Most people have nothing to say to each other. That was back in 1998 that he said that. And by 2005, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. I don't know how this guy keeps his credibility in these elite circles when he has been so wrong about so many things, from the internet to inflation to the staying power of Bitcoin. The fact that Paul Krugman hates the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve is the most bullish sign yet that this is a good idea for the country and for the world. So that was just my soapbox that I had to get on this morning. But Brian, do you have any other thoughts or any other grab bag items from this week?
No, that was very well done. And it really is quite amazing that people still listen to Paul Krugman and don't just run in the opposite direction. And don't forget, I'll add another example to his wrongness, which was his prediction that should Donald Trump be elected president of the United States, the stock market would crash and that we would all experience, a horrific economy. Of course, in Trump's presidency, the market hit record highs. I staffed him for a press conference when I believe it was when the S&P cracked over 30,000, congratulating everyone for their very healthy 401ks. So Krugman is, I think, serially wrong is the right way to frame it. And his continued disdain and hatred of Bitcoin appears to be more emotional or philosophical than it is fact-based. So the fact that he is still, even with Bitcoin now bumps in the road, it's in the 50,000s, mid 50s. It's recently been in the 70,000 range. Note that 10 or 11 years ago, when he said Bitcoin was evil, it was priced at $700. So wrong yet again. We're way beyond strike 3 at this point. I think we're at strike 6 or 7 of really, really major predictions, very strongly opinionated predictions that were just dead wrong. So very important to consider the source of your information. And a lot of these economists, the inflation is transitory. I will say he is in very healthy company. There have been a lot of economists claiming that inflation was transitory, that it's going away. On that, I would make one other point, which is that even if inflation is calming and getting a little bit less bad, it's still just that, it's less bad. And prices are settling in at an unaffordable level for most middle-class families. And Secretary Mnuchin, who of course was Secretary of the Treasury for the Trump presidency, pointed this out recently as well, that just if the inflation rate is decreasing, that doesn't mean that prices are settling into an affordable place. We still have an affordability problem in the US. And, Krugman, even in his inflation analysis, was removing some really core items to try to reach that result, manipulating the data. So consider the source. And in this case, I think when you do, it should lead you in the other direction and really just kind of, be open to new ideas, because I think the economy of the future is going to look a lot different than it does today or than it did yesterday. And I think looking forward in terms of Bitcoin policy is going to make the US more of a leader and healthier long-term in terms of our economy.
Very well put. Yeah, I'd completely forgotten that he called for an economic crash when Trump was elected, and the end result was the Trump pump.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be surprised if he makes the same prediction again. He's not one for self-awareness, that's for sure. But yeah, a lot to unpack this week, and a lot to unpack going forward. We'll watch closely as we see the Democratic National Convention on the horizon. We've got a really competitive election ahead of us. I think it will come down to a neck and neck race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And the outcome of this election will have huge impacts on Bitcoin. And we'll keep you all posted every step of the way here in the Peer-to-Peer podcast. I think that about closes us out for today. Is there anything else we missed, Brian?
I think that was a pretty good grab bag, just running through the Krugmanisms. Pulling a Krugman, I think, is going to be maybe our new mantra. Every time we get to debunk the experts TM, maybe we'll call it pulling a Krugman. So that was a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for joining us. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Follow us on X at Morgenstern and Jay at Sam Lyman 33. Send us a note if you like what you saw, if you don't like what you saw, if you have questions, or if you have topics you want us to talk about, please do reach out. We're very open to feedback. But thanks for joining us, everybody, and we will be back for the next episode of the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod.